I'm Anna Witkowski.
And I'm Tyler Williams, and today we're going to talk about why adoption matters. Anna, with your role at Comprex, I know you work a lot around adoption for end users. Can you tell me a little bit about the challenges that IT organizations face with forcing the adoption for these?
I think the biggest thing is organizations don't really see the value up front on adoption. They sort of assume that their end users will be fine. They look at their main focus, their core focus. For many of our clients that we deal with is email, getting their email migrated into Office 365. That's really the lowest hanging fruit for many organizations, right? All these other features, Skype for Business, OneDrive for Business, Planner, Teams, Groups, that's all sort of gravy on top and not really their main focus. What they want to make sure is everyone's email account is migrated, there's no business disruption, and the transition is seamless, which makes sense. And they also have some competing technology investments, right? So they may already have implemented GoToMeeting, which obviously has some redundancy and capabilities with Skype for Business, as well as Box.com for OneDrive for Business. There's some redundancy there. So they don't really see their current environment as being broken, right? And if it's not broke, don't fix it. They sort of stick to their guns.
I know you mentioned lots of competing technologies. Not all of the technologies that exist within Office 365 necessarily could be competing. Maybe they do certain functionality or features, but I know over time you mentioned kind of a slower adoption, right? So I have maybe moving everybody to Exchange Online is the first low-hanging fruit that I have, and that's getting my feet wet into the cloud. Over time, I may end up having 6 months, 9 months, a year between when I'm actually getting my users first in Office 365 or migrating their mailboxes. Maybe it's not a weekend thing. Maybe it's something that happens over a period of time. How do you find that with these competing technologies, over time, I'm able to start turning on new features instead of saying to the early adopters, you have to wait now to get something until everybody's been migrated?
For most organizations, yeah, migration is not going to be a weekend type engagement. It's going to go over several weeks or even months. And that's the perfect time to build out an adoption plan. You don't want to wait until everyone's live in Office 365 to then scuffle and put together some sort of change management or adoption plan. So having a group of early adopters, or as we like to call them, champions, can be really beneficial to an adoption plan. Because you're right, not everyone is going to be live with features at the same time. So having a select group of champions to be sort of like not just the guinea pigs who get early access and training on a tool, but really sort of act as an internal resource for their colleagues they're going to be very familiar with the tool, that once their colleagues who may take a little bit longer to be live, they'll have somebody, one of their peers that they can come to ask questions and onboard.
Great. Roadmap that you're talking about, is this something that's a fluid roadmap? Is it something that's one time I start planning after I start putting my users in Office 365? I'm then going to update this roadmap, or is it just I start now and it's implemented over time?
The roadmap is definitely a living and breathing document, so it's not something that we create and it's set in stone. The roadmap sort of comes to fruition, as I mentioned, during the migration phase, not once everyone's live in Office 365, to really have some of those strategic conversations, understand a company's needs, right? The way one organization uses Office 365 is completely different than how another organization is going to see value in Office 365. So having those conversations, building out a strategic roadmap to continue the onboarding process. But then once they're live, once the users start to engage in training, maybe priorities change, business needs shift, then we're going to update that roadmap accordingly. So it's definitely going to be something that we create at the beginning as sort of a foundation, but it's ever evolving.
And you mentioned training. Training, this is on end user training. Is this something that we can, as users go through training, we can actually measure the success that they are adopting this? Is that something we find valuable in either the IT organization or even end users to feel happy about that?
There's definitely different ways that you can gather feedback from end users. Obviously, there's surveys, customer feedback surveys to get from them whether or not they're seeing value in the training. Again, the training's not going to be one size fits all by any means. But then as part of our unified cloud management offering here at Comprex, we actually have adoption dashboards where we can go in and see, for example, 65% of Company X's end users are active users of OneDrive for Business, and active being that they've logged in the past 7 days. What's important for users, or for us to be able to identify, is who is part of that 35%. Is it a role-based reason, like maybe a legal department, they don't want to have their documents stored in OneDrive for Business,
Sure.
So they're not going to be as heavily adopting OneDrive, but maybe it's weakness in the adoption trends. So if it's marketing who they should be actively leveraging OneDrive. Well, maybe there's some sort of hole that they're not taking in the information as heavily or as successfully as another department. So we can take a step back, provide some maybe additional training, or gather feedback from them on why it is that they're not successfully adopting OneDrive for Business like the rest of their users.
Do you have recommendations on terms of how Microsoft is actually changing on a daily basis or hourly basis or monthly basis? A lot of changes that are happening within the cloud space, right? So how do organizations take that change and actually adopt that into their own roadmap for adoption?
That's part of what Comprix helps, what we help with, is keeping IT admins specifically abreast of all of these changes that are constantly rolling out from Microsoft, right? We just had Teams that recently launched out of preview just this past March, right? So keeping them abreast of big changes like that, or also just little small feature updates, tweaks here and there, as part of the Microsoft Office 365 roadmap. That's going to be another factor that's really going to potentially affect the roadmap for some end users or some organizations. I think that's a really good point or a really good segue into the IT admin side of things. So obviously, the focus that I have a lot on is making sure the end users are empowered enough, have the correct information to be able to make sound decisions on which tool is best to use and when. But in conjunction with that, the IT admins need to feel comfortable enough with these new tools, right? In a lot of IT admins' minds, when you migrate data to the cloud, they sort of have to relinquish control in a sense. And I'm sure you can sort of speak to that a little bit with your experience working directly with a lot of IT admins.
Sure, we see a lot of IT admins over time either get scared or nervous about the changes that are happening and how to keep up with the changes. It's a very fast-paced, it can be fast-paced, right? We want to make sure that not only are we keeping up with the changes, but we understand how that implements either into our roadmap or our end users. We want to make sure that they're using the technology. But more so, you talked about competing technologies in the past. Over time, we may find that there are competing technologies that Microsoft, you mentioned Teams, right? So we know that there's other applications that departments may use that exist within the Office 365 space. How do we tie those back to what now is offered in the Microsoft space potentially, continuously and over time? And so we do see that a lot. I think that's a very important key component that IT admins struggle with, and it's very important to make sure that that's constantly evolved.
Yep. I think it's also difficult a lot of times for IT admins to see from the end user perspective, right? In their minds, they're sort of power users within their organization. But making sure that there's a solid and sound foundation for all of their end users to be successful in Office 365, that's where adoption planning really comes into play. Because you have to answer that question at multiple different levels. At the organizational level, maybe there's a solution that you want to implement across all users, like Skype for Business. That's a really common implementation right off the bat. But maybe it's an implementation that you're going to focus on at a department level, right? Maybe you want to pilot Planner within marketing team, for example, as well as at the individual level. What end users care most about, right? When you talk about, hey, my organization is migrating to Office 365, that sounds exciting and all, but what they want to know is what's in it for them. That's cool, but how is this going to affect my day-to-day business? Right. Because not every organization is going to utilize Office 365 the same way. So having those communications as part of that adoption plan, making the users feel like they're part of the process and informed, is going to be really important.
And I think IT, going back to you asked about IT admins struggling with some of that, as you have these roadmaps that talk about department or organization, even individual level changes that may happen, we need to make sure that we're planning for that in the IT admin space. We talked about slow adoption. Over time, we may have months between when our early adopters are actually in the Office 365 platform, and maybe when new features get turned on, or maybe new features get turned on or changed or deprecated mid-process. And I think it's really important to make sure that we have also planned on the IT admin side to ensure that we have the appropriate prerequisites. Maybe that's things like our clients are changing, we have to have certain updates available or patch levels on the machine. So that's a probably important thing to think about on the admin side as well.
I think the most important thing to note is it's going to be a conjunction of both sides.
Sure.
Obviously, the end users are what's most important, but making sure the IT admin have the correct setup for their end users so there isn't any additional factors that could potentially hinder adoption is really key. So that preparation ahead of time is a big part of it as well. And having that sustained commitment after the fact. So once we are engaging the end users, it's not going to be a one and done type training. Going through the motions, having a 1 or 2 hour live training is not going to provide end users with enough knowledge to be able to feel comfortable to use a tool. And then what ends up happening is users, if they're not comfortable enough with a new tool, they're just going to revert back to what they know, which is, for many people, email. So continuing to provide that sustained awareness and commitment, videos, communications, surveys, whatever may work best for that organization, you need to continue that over time.
And that really goes back to the investment they're making in the platform, right?
Yeah, I think it's understanding that, yes, email is part of that Office 365 suite, but optimizing your experience in Office 365, finding some of those redundant, potentially, solutions like Skype for Business and GoToMeeting, you could potentially see some cost savings there, which I know is conversations that you're very heavily involved in.
Absolutely. Cost control is probably one of the biggest things IT admins focus on. We want to make sure that we're controlling the cost. We talked about shadow IT earlier, right? So how many organizations do you know of that a department can easily go out with a purchase card and say, I'm going to go pay for WebEx, for example, is a great example of that. Maybe not knowing or having the training or understanding that either IT is going to support and help train to get the users to start using another competing product that they may already have, such as Skype, or that maybe we have a corporate investment in something like this. So having the understanding and training is key in IT.
And having that executive sponsorship. So whatever the IT team is investing in, it's important that the end users are aware of that. So if we are going to focus on implementing Skype for Business, having that executive sponsorship, that executive buy-in from the top really underscores the importance and kind of brings it to the attention of the end users of, hey, Mr. CEO, they're clearly involved in this process, it must be important. So making sure that it's a team effort. It's not just going to be, when I work with our clients here at CompuRx, I'm not just speaking with the VP of IT or the CIO or whoever it may be at the top, but it's the system admins, it's the department leads, it's the champions that we talked about earlier. It's really a team effort, and that's important for the IT admin to keep in mind, right? When we talk about all of these different layers of an adoption process, it may seem a bit overwhelming, but that's why they have us here at CompuRx, and also it's a team effort internally within that organization as well.
And I'm sure it's really hard to kind of come up with a matrix to say, if you're trying to do this, then you're going to use this. If you're trying to talk to these people, you're going to use this. And really finding that balance about who you're talking to and what tools you're using and when you're using it and why you're using it, how you're using it from an IT standpoint. Do you find IT organizations or even end users focusing on that and looking for that?
I think it's really easy for users to want to come with a scenario and say, which option should I use? Should I use Outlook versus OneDrive, or Teams versus Planner? And the way Office 365 and the way Microsoft created Office 365 and intended for it to be utilized was looking at it in a holistic or complementary manner, where it's not a question of this versus that, but this and that. So utilizing Outlook actively, utilizing OneDrive for Business, utilizing Planner, and utilizing Teams all together creates this maximum value in your Office 365 experience. So I think it does take a lot of different layers, and making sure the users feel informed enough where they can kind of create their own matrix. I like the way you think of that, right? Where it's not going to be a black and white, you absolutely should use OneDrive for Business in this scenario. But looking at different factors, I think two of the biggest factors that really influence a user when they decide which option is best to use and when is sense of urgency, as well as audience size. So are you trying to reach someone quickly, or is it something that you can maybe wait a little bit? If it's quickly, obviously you'd use Skype for Business, for example. As well as audience size. So if you're sharing a file with, a file between you and I, Tyler, I'll send it to you via OneDrive. But if it's something that's meant for the entire GMS, our Global Management Services team, then that might need to go in a more structured site location, such as SharePoint Online, right? So understanding the audience size as well as a sense of urgency, I think those are one of the two, if not the two biggest variables when a user should keep in mind when making a decision.
Nice. So I think we're getting close to time. If you had to leave one tip or trick for organizations on how they can best implement adoption of these technologies and really help the IT organization and the end users feel empowered and happy, what would you want to leave that?
I would say don't assume that all of your end users are going to be as successful as you think they're going to be with the tool. For example, Skype for Business, a lot of people see that as just another unified communication solution. We've all used one at some point or another in our life, whether it's the consumer version of Skype or AOL Messenger, Facebook Messenger, right? But that's not the case, right? So making sure that everyone is provided the same amount of support and training so that the whole organization can be successful, I think is key.
Awesome. I really appreciate your time. Look forward to future episodes of Cloudcast, and thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.